I wish I could tell you that what we heard at Stillwater Quarry was just our imagination, that the grinding of machinery and men's voices calling out in the dark were just the wind playing tricks. But 5 months later, I still wake up hearing that distant foreman's whistle, and I can't bring myself to delete the recordings on my phone. It started as a typical guy's weekend camping trip. Mike, Dave, and I have been doing these quarterly retreats since college, though we'd grown more selective about our spots over the years. We weren't interested in crowded campgrounds with RVs and screaming kids anymore. This time, Mike had found what seemed perfect, an abandoned limestone quarry in western Pennsylvania. The local township had acquired the land a few years back, and while it wasn't officially a camping area, it wasn't prohibited either. "Check this out," Mike had said during our planning session, sliding his phone across my kitchen table. Stillwater Quarry, operated from 1923 to 1991. There's this huge lake in the main pit now, and the whole place is just forgotten. The photos showed a landscape that seemed almost alien. Sheer limestone walls dropping into crystalline blue-green water, scattered machinery slowly being reclaimed by nature, old access roads winding through autumn forests. It was exactly the kind of place we love to explore. We arrived late Friday afternoon in early October, the kind of perfect fall day that makes you glad to be alive. The quarry was even more impressive in person. We parked at an old gate and hiked in about a mile to a flat area overlooking the main pit. The lake below us was mirror still, reflecting the white limestone cliffs like some kind of portal to another world. "This is insane," Dave said, dropping his pack. "How is this place not crawling with people?" The answer became clear as we set up camp. The whole site had an underlying atmosphere of decay that casual visitors would probably find unsettling. Rusted cable spools bigger than cars lay half buried in the earth. Ancient conveyor belt structures stretched across gaps in the rock like the rib cages of metal giants. Everything was silent except for the occasional cry of a hawk and the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. We got our tent set up and gathered firewood before dark. The temperature was dropping fast, but we had plenty of warm gear and beer to keep us comfortable. As night fell, we sat around the fire trading the usual stories and jokes, our voices echoing slightly off the quarry walls. It was just after midnight when we heard it, a low mechanical rumble, like a diesel engine idling somewhere in the darkness. "Someone else camping out here?" Dave asked, looking around. Mike shook his head. "Didn't see any other vehicles at the gate. Probably just carries weird from the highway." But the highway was over 5 miles away, and this sound had a different quality to it. It was accompanied by a rhythmic grinding noise, like heavy gears turning under load. We all fell silent listening. The sounds continued for maybe 30 seconds, then faded out. "Okay, that was weird," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Ghost bulldozer?" We laughed it off and went back to our conversations. But I noticed we were all speaking a little quieter, straining to hear if the noise would return. About an hour later, it did. And this time, there was something else with it. "Watch the left side there, Jimmy. Easy does it." The voice was distant but clear, carrying through the still night air with an odd hollow quality. It was followed by the metallic screech of machinery and another voice responding, too faint to make out the words. Dave was already on his feet, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "Hello? Someone out there?" The only response was the continuing mechanical sounds, and what seemed to be more voices, just at the edge of comprehension. The beam of Dave's light revealed nothing but trees and rock faces. "This is really starting to freak me out," Mike said, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to record this." The sounds continued sporadically through the night. Equipment running, men calling out to each other, the sharp blast of what could only be a foreman's whistle. Sometimes they seemed to come from the direction of the lake, other times from deeper in the quarry. We never saw any lights or movement. None of us slept much. When dawn finally came, we hiked around the entire accessible area of the quarry. There were no other campers, no equipment, no signs of any recent activity at all. The old machinery we found was clearly abandoned, thick with rust, and partially buried in decades of accumulated soil. Maybe it was some kind of maintenance crew, Dave suggested as we made coffee back at camp, working on water treatment stuff for the lake or something. At midnight, without any vehicles or lights, Mike shook his head. No way. And listen to this. He played back the recording from his phone. The sounds were there, clear as they had been in person. Machinery running, voices calling out, that piercing whistle. But something about hearing it in daylight made it even more unsettling. The voices had an echoey, distant quality that didn't sound quite natural. We spent the day exploring and rock climbing, trying to convince ourselves that there must be a logical explanation. But as the sun set, none of us wanted to acknowledge the growing tension. We built the fire up bigger than necessary and kept our flashlights close at hand. The sound started earlier this time, just after 11 p.m. The mechanical grinding was louder, more urgent somehow. The voices were clearer too. Time's wasting, boys. We need this load out by morning. Cable's not looking good on number 3. Someone get a light over here. Mike was recording again, slowly turning in a circle to track the sounds. That's when Dave spoke up, his voice tight with tension. Hey! Has anyone actually looked up when this place shut down? Like, why it closed? I pulled out my phone, fingers shaking slightly as I typed Stillwater Quarry closure into the search bar. The first result made my blood run cold. March 15th, 1991, I read aloud. Operations ceased following a catastrophic night shift accident that claimed the lives of 7 workers. A cable failure caused. The sudden blast of a whistle cut through the night, closer than any of the sounds so far. We all jumped. The mechanical noises reached a fever pitch, accompanied by shouts of alarm. The cable, get back. Everybody get dash. The cacophony cut off abruptly, leaving us in total silence. Even the normal night sounds, insects, wind in the trees, seemed to have disappeared. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Without discussing it, we started breaking down our camp. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew we wouldn't be sleeping there tonight. As we worked, I could have sworn I heard something else, just at the edge of hearing. The sound of water dripping and what might have been voices muffled as if coming from underwater. We were packed and hiking out within 20 minutes, using our phone lights to negotiate the access road. No one spoke until we reached the cars. As Mike unlocked his truck, Dave cleared his throat. So, we're agreed that really happened, right? We all experienced the same thing. Play the recording, I said. Mike pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he pulled up the audio file. He pressed play. We heard our own nervous conversation, the crackle of the fire, and nothing else. The machinery, the voices, the whistle, none of it had been captured. But here's the thing. The timestamp on the video file shows it was recorded on October 5th, 2023 at 11:47 p.m. When I looked up the quarry accident later, I found more details. The cable failure had occurred at 11:47 p.m. on October 5th, 1991, exactly 32 years before, to the minute. I've gone back through Mike's recording dozens of times since then, using every audio enhancement tool I can find. There's nothing there but us. And yet, all 3 of us heard it. We still talk about it sometimes, late at night when we can't sleep. Dave thinks we witnessed some kind of residual haunting, a tragedy echoing through time. Mike insists there must be a rational explanation. Sound carrying from somewhere else, our minds playing tricks on us. Me? I keep thinking about that last whistle blast, how close it sounded. Like whoever blew it was standing right behind us, trying desperately to warn us about something. Sometimes I wonder if maybe we weren't hearing an echo of the past at all. Maybe we were hearing a warning about the future. I haven't been camping since that night. Mike and Dave have invited me on other trips, to normal campgrounds with RVs and families, and no abandoned quarries in sight. Maybe someday I'll take them up on it. But for now, I can't shake the feeling that there are places where the barrier between then and now, between here and gone, gets thin enough to tear. Places where the past isn't really past at all, but still playing out its ancient tragedies in an endless loop, just waiting for someone to tune into the right frequency and hear those voices in the dark, calling out their warnings across the years. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull up that empty audio recording and listen one more time, straining to hear what I know is there just beneath the silence. Because here's the thing about ghost stories. The really scary ones aren't about what you see or hear. They're about what you know happened, even when there's no evidence left behind. They're about the way certain moments can echo through time, playing themselves out over and over, trying to tell us something important. I just wish I knew what those men were trying to tell us that night at Stillwater Quarry. I have a feeling it was something we really needed to hear. The first repair was so subtle, I almost missed it. Just a tiny line of perfect stitches, barely visible against the dark green fabric of my tent. I might never have noticed if the morning sun hadn't caught the thread at just the right angle, making it shimmer like spider silk. That's when I realized two things that made my blood run cold. I hadn't packed any sewing supplies, and I definitely hadn't sewn this. My name's Sarah, and I've been doing solo backpacking trips for the better part of a decade. After my divorce 3 years ago, these solitary excursions became less of a hobby and more of a lifeline. There's something about carrying everything you need on your back and walking until your legs ache that helps put life's problems in perspective. This particular trip was a 4-day trek along the Appalachian Trail's most remote section in Maine. I'd planned it meticulously, checking weather reports and trail conditions, making sure my gear was in perfect shape. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I'd made good time, covering 15 miles before setting up camp in a small clearing just off the trail. The evening air had that perfect October crispness that makes you glad to be alive. I remember sitting outside my tent, watching the stars appear one by one while my freeze-dried stroganoff rehydrated, feeling completely at peace. I slept soundly that night, waking only once to the sound of what I assumed was a deer moving through the underbrush. When I emerged from my tent the next morning, that's when I noticed the stitching. It was a repair of a small tear I hadn't even known existed, just above the tent side entrance. The work was immaculate. Tiny, even stitches in thread that matched the tent's fabric perfectly. "That's not possible," I said aloud, running my finger along the repair. The stitches were real enough, pulled taut, and knotted with expert precision. I spent breakfast trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd repaired it before a previous trip and forgotten, but I knew that wasn't true. I obsessively documented all gear maintenance in a spreadsheet. Maybe the tear had been there when I bought the tent, already repaired by the previous owner, but this was a new tent purchased directly from REI just 2 months ago. I packed up camp slowly, double-checking everything. Nothing else seemed out of place or disturbed. My food bag was still securely hung where I'd left it, my other gear untouched. I told myself it was just one of those weird things that happen sometimes in the backcountry, and started hiking. The second night, I made sure to check every inch of my tent before turning in. No tears, no repairs, nothing unusual. I even took photos with my phone, thinking that if anything changed overnight, I'd have proof. I set up my cook pot with some small stones around it, arranging them in a pattern that would show if anyone walked through camp. Again, I slept soundly, but this time I dreamed. In the dream, I heard the software thread being pulled through fabric, like my grandmother used to make when she taught me to sew as a child. The sound was oddly comforting, and in my dream, I smiled. Morning revealed 2 new repairs. One was on my backpack, a strengthened seam along the shoulder strap that I'd noticed was starting to wear thin. The other was a small patch on my rainfly, covering a pinhole I definitely hadn't seen before. Both repairs used the same perfect stitching as the first, with thread that matched exactly. My hands shook as I examined them. The stone pattern around my cook pot was undisturbed. There were no footprints in the soft earth around my tent, No broken twigs or bent grass to suggest anyone had approached in the night. Just those pristine repairs, appearing as if by magic. I should have hiked out then. Any rational person would have. But there was something about those repairs that felt benevolent. They weren't destructive or threatening. Quite the opposite. Someone or something was fixing my gear with more skill and care than I could have managed myself. The third night, I left out a torn shirt I'd been meaning to mend. It was an old flannel, worn thin at the elbows, with a small rip along one seam. I placed it deliberately on top of my pack before turning in, then lay awake for hours listening. Just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it, the softest whisper of movement outside my tent. Not footsteps exactly, but a gentle rustling, like autumn leaves being stirred by a breeze. Then came the sound from my dream, the barely audible pull of thread through fabric. Every muscle in my body tensed. I should look outside, I thought, should grab my headlamp and confront whatever was out there. But something kept me still, my eyes squeezed shut, breathing as quietly as I could. The sound continued, methodical and somehow soothing, for what felt like hours. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. Dawn revealed the flannel shirt, folded neatly on my pack. The tear was mended so perfectly I had trouble finding where it had been. But there was more. All the worn spots had been reinforced with tiny decorative stitches and patterns that looked like leaves and vines. The thread shifted colors slightly in the light, sometimes appearing green, sometimes silver, sometimes not visible at all. That's when I found the note. It was written on a piece of birch bark in handwriting, so delicate it almost looked like natural patterns in the wood. Threads that bind need mending true. What's broken can be made like new. A stitch in time saves more than 9. When care is given, all will shine. I sat there for a long time, running my fingers over the stitches and reading the note over and over. The rational part of my brain was screaming that none of this made sense, that I should be terrified. But I wasn't. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. That night, my last on the trail, I did something either very brave or very foolish. Before getting into my tent, I spoke aloud to the empty forest. Thank you for the repairs. They're beautiful. I have one more, if you're willing. I placed my old wool hat on top of my pack. It had been my father's before he passed, and I'd been heartbroken when moths got to it last winter, leaving several small holes. Then I went into my tent, but this time I didn't close my eyes. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light through the tent walls. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I saw it, a shadow moving across the tent wall. Not a human shadow, but something more fluid, like watching smoke take form. I held my breath as the shadow settled over my pack where I'd left the hat. What happened next is hard to describe. The moonlight seemed to gather and concentrate, taking on an almost liquid quality. Within it, I could just make out something like hands, transparent as morning dew, working with impossible speed and grace. Thread appeared from nowhere, glinting like strands of starlight. I watched transfixed as the hat was repaired by those ethereal hands. The holes disappeared under patterns of snowflakes and stars, each one unique and perfect. When it was done, the shadow remained for a moment, hovering like mist. I could have sworn it turned toward me, and though I saw no face, I felt a warm smile. "Thank you," I whispered. The shadow dissipated like fog in morning sun. When I checked the hat, it was better than new. The repairs were both functional and beautiful, and wearing it felt like being wrapped in a warm hug. I've been back to those woods several times since then, but I've never seen the shadow again. Sometimes, though, I wake up to find small repairs on my gear. A reinforced zipper, a strengthened seam, always with those same perfect stitches that shimmer in the right light. I've never told anyone this story before. Who would believe it? A mysterious nocturnal seamstress, mending gear in the wilderness with thread that appears and disappears like moonlight. But every time I wear that hat or use that tent or carry that pack, I'm reminded that not all strange encounters in the woods need to be frightening. Sometimes, if we're very lucky, we cross paths with something ancient and kind, something that remembers when all broken things could be made whole again with patience and care, something that still believes in the power of small kindnesses offered freely in the dark. I keep that birch bark note pinned above my desk, and sometimes, when life feels like it's unraveling at the seams, I read it and remember. There are still mysteries in the world that mean us well, and sometimes the most magical things happen when we simply allow them to. The next time you're in the woods and hear the soft sound of thread being pulled through fabric in the night, don't be afraid. Just whisper a thank you to the mender, and know that something out there still cares enough to repair what's broken, one perfect stitch at a time. They say the devil's in the details, but what I found in my backpack during those 3 days in the Adirondacks wasn't demonic. It was something far more unsettling, because when a stranger knows enough about you to leave pieces of your own childhood in the wilderness, you have to ask yourself, how long have they been watching? It started with a butterscotch candy. I found it nestled in the bottom of my backpack's front pocket while searching for my map. Just a single piece, wrapped in that distinctive golden cellophane, the kind my grandmother used to keep in her purse. I figured it must have fallen in there during my last visit to her house, though that had been months ago. I was 2 days into a solo hiking trip, pushing deeper into the backcountry than I usually went. The weather was perfect, late September, with just enough chill in the air to keep the bugs away. I'd picked this remote section of trail specifically because I needed to clear my head. Work had been intense. My relationship had just ended messily, and I wanted to get far enough from cell service that none of it could reach me. That first candy didn't set off any alarms. I actually smiled when I found it, thinking of Grandma Rose. She'd passed away last spring, and finding that candy felt like a little hello from her. I unwrapped it and let the sweet butterscotch melt on my tongue while I hiked, remembering Sunday afternoons at her house. The paper clip appeared the next morning, just a single silver clip, sitting perfectly centered on top of my carefully folded trail map. I distinctly remembered putting the map in my jacket pocket the night before, not in my pack. But I'd been tired, and it's easy to misremember small things when you're alone in the woods. The rubber duck was harder to explain away. It was tiny, no bigger than my thumbnail, the kind that comes in children's bath toy sets. Yellow rubber, slightly faded, with one googly eye missing, exactly like the one that used to live in my parents' bathroom when I was a kid. I found it tucked into my pack's water bottle holder while setting up camp on the second night. My hands shook as I held it. There was no way this was a coincidence. This was my duck, the one I'd named Mister. Quacks when I was 4. I remembered the missing eye, remembered the day it fell down the drain, and my father had to buy a new set to stop my tears. But Mister Quacks had disappeared during our move when I was 12. How could he be here, 20 years later, in my backpack in the middle of nowhere? I didn't sleep much that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me sitting bolt upright in my tent. I kept my headlamp and knife close at hand, though what good they'd do against someone who could slip things into my pack without me noticing, I wasn't sure. Morning brought more items. A plastic army man, the exact shade of green as the ones I used to line up on my windowsill. A friendship bracelet in faded purple and white, the pattern I learned at summer camp when I was 10. A Polaroid photo of me on my first bicycle, one I'd never seen before, but must have been taken by my mother, judging by the angle and the shadow visible in the corner. Each item was placed carefully in a different pocket or compartment of my pack. Each one was undeniably authentic, not just similar to things from my childhood, but the actual objects themselves. Things that should have been lost to time, moves, spring cleanings, and growing up. I laid them all out on my sleeping bag, trying to make sense of it. The candy, the paper clip, the duck, the army man, the bracelet, the photo. 6 items that had no business being here. Each one a piece of my past I thought was gone forever. That's when I noticed they were arranged in chronological order. The duck from when I was 4, the army man from age 6, the bracelet from 10, the photo from when I was 8, the paper clip from my first office job at 22, the butterscotch candy, Grandma Rose's favorite until the day she died last year, my past, laid out in a timeline of small objects. I should have hiked out immediately, should have called the rangers, filed a report, something. But curiosity is a powerful force, and fear can sometimes look an awful lot like fascination. I decided to stay one more night. I triple-checked my pack before going to sleep, photographing the contents of each pocket with my phone. I even set up my emergency bivy sack 100 yards from my tent, thinking I might catch someone approaching in the night. Sleep came eventually, broken and uneasy. I dreamed of childhood rooms, of boxes and attics, of all the small things we leave behind as we grow up. In the dream, they were all waiting somewhere, gathered by patient hands, waiting to find their way back to us. I woke to find my pack exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. In the smallest pocket, the one I use for my keys, I found a single house key. Silver, unmarked, unremarkable in every way except that it was an exact copy of my current house key, the one I just had made last week. That's when the fear finally won out over curiosity. I broke camp in record time, barely bothering to pack properly. Everything went into my bag in a jumble. The mysterious objects wrapped in a shirt and stuffed into a side pocket. I didn't want to touch them anymore, but I couldn't bring myself to leave them behind either. The hike out was a blur of paranoia. Every shadow held a lurking figure. Every bird song sounded like whispered conversations just out of reach. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following with a box full of my past, waiting to return each piece one by one. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized my keys were missing. Not in my pocket, where I always kept them. Not in any of my pack's pockets. Not in my jacket or pants, or anywhere else they should have been. Just gone, replaced by that single silver key that had appeared in the night. My hands trembling, I tried it in the car door. It worked perfectly. I drove home in a daze, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see my childhood toys arranged across the back seat. When I reached my house, I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at that key on my ring. Finally, I gathered my courage and went inside. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. No mysterious objects arranged in timeline order. No childhood memories waiting to be returned. But there was a note on my kitchen table. Written in perfect cursive on what looked like ancient stationery was a simple message. Everything you've lost is waiting to be found. Everything you've forgotten wants to be remembered. When you're ready for the rest, they'll find their way back to you. One small thing at a time. It wasn't signed. The paper crumbled to dust when I tried to pick it up like it had been waiting years just to deliver that message. I still have those objects, locked away in a box in my closet. Sometimes late at night, I take them out and arrange them in order, wondering what other pieces of my past are out there, waiting to return. The key still works in all my locks, though I've had them changed twice. And sometimes, when I misplace something important, I don't look too hard for it anymore. I just wait, knowing that sooner or later, it will find its way back to me. After all, someone out there is collecting all our lost things, keeping them safe until we're ready to remember who we used to be. Just last week, I found a small origami crane on my desk at work. I recognized it immediately. The same one I made in 6th grade art class, the only perfect crane I ever managed to fold. I added it to the box with the others, arranging it carefully in chronological order. The collection grows slowly, one small thing at a time. And somewhere out there, someone is watching, remembering, waiting to return each piece of my past when the time is right. I just wish I knew what they were waiting for me to remember. When you spend enough time in the wilderness, you learn to trust your instincts. That creeping sensation that something's not quite right. It's usually your subconscious picking up on details your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. That's what I kept telling myself about the lantern light, that there had to be a logical explanation for its nightly appearance, moving through the forest in that precise, unchanging pattern. But logic doesn't explain why those survey markers were dated 1876, or why the light followed their path so exactly, or why no one else seemed to see it but us. My daughter Katie was the first to notice it. We'd been at our campsite for maybe an hour, just getting settled in as the sun started to set. She was helping me stake out the tent when she suddenly stopped, pointing toward the tree line. "Dad, look. Someone's out there." I followed her gaze, but saw nothing except deepening shadows among the pines. Where? There was a light, like someone carrying a lantern, but it disappeared. I didn't think much of it at first. Katie had just turned 12, and while she was an experienced camper for her age, imagination tends to run wild in the woods at dusk. Besides, we were in a popular area of Pisgah National Forest. Other campers weren't unusual, though we hadn't seen any on our hike in. We finished setting up camp and started dinner prep. The usual camping routine of boiling water and rehydrating meals that never taste quite as good as they look on the package. The autumn air was crisp, carrying that distinctive smell of pine needles and fallen leaves that always makes me feel at peace. That's when I saw it too. At first, it was just a faint glow through the trees, maybe 100 yards out. It looked exactly like Katie had described, like someone carrying an old-fashioned lantern, the kind that casts a warm yellow light. But something about the movement caught my attention. It wasn't the random bobbing you'd expect from someone walking through rough terrain. The light moved in straight lines, stopping at regular intervals before changing direction at precise angles. "There it is again," Katie whispered, grabbing my arm. "Do you see it now?" I nodded, watching as the light made another perfect right-angle turn. "Probably just a ranger doing evening rounds," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But in 15 years of backcountry camping, I'd never seen a ranger patrol like this. The light continued its geometric pattern for about 10 minutes before fading away. Katie wanted to investigate immediately, but I convinced her to wait until morning. We ate dinner and played cards by our campfire, but I could tell she was distracted, keeping one eye on the darkness beyond our circle of firelight. That night, I lay awake in our tent long after Katie had fallen asleep, thinking about the strange light. There was something familiar about its movement pattern, but I couldn't quite place it. It wasn't until the light appeared again, around midnight, that it clicked. It was moving like a surveyor. I'd worked a summer job with a land survey crew in college, and the methodical way the light moved, straight lines, regular stops, precise turns. It was exactly how we'd moved when mapping property boundaries. But who would be surveying forest land in the middle of the night? The next morning, Katie was up at dawn, eager to explore. After a quick breakfast, we grabbed our day packs and headed in the direction we'd seen the light. The forest was thick with mountain laurel undergrowth, making progress slow. We'd been pushing through the brush for about 20 minutes when Katie called out, "Dad, look at this." She was pointing to a metal disc embedded in a large boulder, a survey marker. The brass surface was dark with age, but the stamped text was still legible. U.S. Geological Survey Reference Point 1876. My first thought was that it had to be a reproduction. Modern survey markers designed to look historical for atmosphere or education. But as we continued searching the area, we found more markers, each one identical and forming a perfect grid. They were all originals, each showing signs of age that couldn't be faked, deep patina, weatherware, even small trees that had grown around them. I was taking photos of one of the markers when Katie gasped, "Dad, look at how they're arranged." She was right. When you stood back and looked at the pattern of markers we'd found, it matched the exact path the light had taken the night before. Every stop, every turn, every straight line between points. We spent the rest of the morning exploring, finding a total of 12 markers. Each one was exactly where we'd seen the light pause in its journey. The precision was unsettling. This wasn't a case of the light roughly following an old survey route. It had stopped at each marker for the exact same amount of time, moved between them at the exact same speed. Back at camp, I tried to research the area's history on my phone, but we were well out of service range. Katie spent the afternoon sketching the markers in her notebook, carefully copying down the dates and coordinates. As sunset approached, we both found ourselves watching the tree line, right on schedule. Just as the last direct sunlight faded from the forest, the lantern light appeared. This time, we were ready. We followed it, keeping a safe distance. We tracked the light as it moved from marker to marker, up close. The light looked different than any flashlight or LED lantern I'd ever seen. It had that distinctive warm flicker of an oil lamp, but there was something else, a quality to the illumination that seemed almost solid, as if the light itself had weight and substance. We never got close enough to see who or what was carrying it. Every time we tried to close the distance, the undergrowth seemed to thicken impossibly, forcing us to stop and untangle ourselves while the light continued its unwavering path. The temperature dropped steadily as we watched, our breath forming clouds in the autumn air. Katie pressed close to my side, shivering despite her warm jacket. "Dad," she whispered, "do you hear that?" At first I didn't. Then, just at the edge of hearing, I caught it. The soft clink of metal on metal, like survey equipment being adjusted. And something else. Was that a voice? The sound was too faint to make out words, but it had an odd, hollow quality, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. It seemed to be counting, measuring, recording data in a methodical murmur that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We watched until the light completed its circuit and faded away. Neither of us spoke much on the walk back to camp. What was there to say? We just watched the survey crew from 1876 mapping the wilderness, their work echoing through nearly 150 years of nights. That evening, as we sat by our fire, Katie asked a question I'd been avoiding. Should we stay another night? I looked at her face in the firelight. There was fear there, yes, but also that unique blend of curiosity and wonder that I've always loved about her. She wasn't asking to leave. She was asking permission to stay and watch the mystery unfold one more time. We did stay. The light appeared twice more that night. Once at midnight, once just before dawn. Each time following the same perfect path. Each time accompanied by those distant sounds of work being done, measurements being taken, boundaries being drawn that would last for centuries. On our last morning, we found something new. At the base of the boulder, holding the first marker we discovered, there was a surveyor's field book. The leather cover was cracked and weathered, the pages yellow with age. Inside, in careful copperplate handwriting, were detailed notes and measurements. The last entry was dated October 15th, 1876. Final survey complete. Territory mapped as requested. Note: boundaries must be maintained. The work must continue. The lines must be walked. Until relief arrives. The signature at the bottom was too faded to read. We left the book where we found it. Some things belong to the past, even if the past isn't quite done with them yet. But sometimes on clear autumn nights, I think about that lantern light, still moving through the forest in its perfect pattern, still measuring, still recording, still waiting for relief that may never come. Katie and I go back sometimes, though we never stay overnight anymore. We day hike the area, checking on the markers, making sure they're still there. They always are. Their brass faces growing darker with age, but the coordinates still clear and true. Sometimes we find new pages from that field book, scattered among the fallen leaves like breadcrumbs through time. And sometimes, just as we're leaving at sunset, we catch a glimpse of a warm yellow light through the trees, beginning its endless rounds. When we do, Katie always squeezes my hand and whispers, "They're still at work, Dad. Still keeping the boundaries." I squeeze back and nod, knowing that somewhere in those dark woods, the surveyor's light continues its patient journey, walking lines laid down before my grandmother was born, measuring and remeasuring a wilderness that refuses to be fully tamed. Walking, measuring, waiting until relief arrives. The first origami crane appeared outside my tent on the third morning of my solo trek. It was crafted from a page of my own journal, a page I hadn't even noticed was missing. What terrified me wasn't just its mysterious appearance, or even the fact that someone had been close enough to take from my journal while I slept. It was the perfect, intricate folding of a moment I'd lived just hours before, depicted in paper with impossible precision. I'm a writer by trade, which means I meticulously document everything. It's a habit that served me well over years of travel writing assignments, filling journal after journal with observations, sketches, and random thoughts. This particular trip to the Cascade Mountains was supposed to be personal, not professional. A chance to clear my head after my mother's passing and sort through some of her belongings I'd brought along. The journal entry that became that first crane had described watching a family of deer at sunset the evening before. Written in my hurried scrawl were details about their movements, the way the last sunlight caught their fur, how the fawn had stumbled slightly crossing a fallen log. The origami crane captured all of it. The words of my description twisted and folded into the exact shapes I'd observed. When held up to the light, you could read fragments of the text through the translucent folds. Graceful leap, shadow dappled, autumn gold. I spent an hour examining every inch of my campsite, looking for footprints, broken twigs, any sign of an intruder. Nothing. The ground around my tent was undisturbed, the perimeter of pine needles I'd arranged the night before still in perfect formation. Yet somehow, someone had not only read my private thoughts, but transformed them into art while I slept. I should have hiked out immediately. Any rational person would have. But curiosity has always been my fatal flaw. It's what makes me a good writer and occasionally a poor decision maker. I decided to stay to see if it would happen again. That evening, I made a show of writing in my journal by firelight, describing the day's events including finding the crane. I drew a detailed sketch of the origami piece, noted its measurements and the exact words visible through each fold. Then I made sure to zip the journal securely in my pack before turning in. I barely slept, straining to hear any sound of movement outside my tent. The night passed in a blur of wind through pine needles and distant owl calls. At some point, exhaustion must have won out because I woke to gray dawn light and another origami figure outside my tent door. This time it was a fox, formed from the very pages where I documented the crane. The folding was even more intricate, the paper somehow capturing the alert ears, the curious tilt of the head, even the texture of fur through sophisticated pleating of the paper. When I moved it, I could see my own words about finding the first origami piece woven through its form. My hands shook as I photographed it from every angle. The craftsmanship was beyond anything I'd seen. Not just origami, but a form of paper sculpture that seemed to capture movement itself. The fox appeared ready to leap from my palm, its paper muscles tense for action. That day, I filled page after page with theories and observations. Was I dealing with some reclusive origami master living in the wilderness? A performance artist executing an elaborate installation? Had grief finally cracked my sanity, leading me to create these pieces myself in some fugue state? The third night, I set up my phone to record time-lapse video of my tent entrance. I wrote extensively about this plan in my journal, describing the exact position of the camera and its field of view. Then I added a personal note about my mother, how she used to fold simple origami animals for me when I was sick as a child, how I wished I could show her these mysterious paper creatures appearing in the wilderness. I woke to find my phone exactly where I'd left it, still recording, but the memory was completely empty. No photos, no video, nothing. And outside my tent was the most elaborate creation yet, a tree of life, its branches formed from the pages containing my memories of mother. Each tiny leaf was folded from a single word, the whole thing capturing not just the shape of a tree, but the feeling of maternal love, of loss, of memory itself rendered in paper. Tears blurred my vision as I read the fragments visible through the folds. Her gentle hands, chicken soup and paper cranes, miss her every day. The piece seemed to glow in the morning light, as if illuminated from within by the emotions it contained. That's when I noticed a pattern. Each origami piece wasn't just made from my words. It was teaching me something. The crane had captured observation. The fox had reflected back my curiosity, and this tree was showing me how memory could be transformed into something new, something beautiful. I spent that day writing with a new purpose, filling pages with questions about the origami maker. Who were they? What were they trying to tell me? How did they work with such precision in darkness? The words flowed like water, my grief and curiosity tangling together on the page. The fourth morning brought an answer, though not the one I expected. Outside my tent was a perfect paper mirror, folded from the pages of my questions. When I held it up, I could see my own reflection in the intricate pattern of creases and folds. But it wasn't my current face looking back. It was me as a child, watching my mother fold paper birds at my bedside. The final piece appeared as I was breaking camp on the 5th day. A simple butterfly, made from my last journal entry. But this one was different. The paper was blank except for a single sentence folded into its wings. Sometimes the stories we need to tell ourselves can only be read in reflection. I never discovered who or what created those origami pieces during those nights in the wilderness. I've shown the photographs to origami experts who insist such complex folds are impossible, especially in darkness. The pieces themselves dissolved into ordinary paper the day I hiked out, leaving only my memories and journal entries as proof they ever existed. But something changed in me during those 5 days. I started folding paper again, like my mother taught me. Simple creatures at first, cranes and boats and foxes, each one containing a memory, a story, a moment transformed. My grief didn't disappear, but it changed shape, became something I could hold in my hands and examine from different angles. Sometimes late at night, when I'm working on a particularly complex fold, I swear I feel other hands guiding mine. Not my mother's, but something older, something that understands how stories and memories can be reshaped into new forms of truth. Something that knows that the most powerful stories are the ones we fold into new shapes and tell ourselves. I've been back to those woods several times, but I've never found another origami piece. My journal pages remain intact, my words unstolen and unfolded. But sometimes, when I'm writing by firelight, I catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision, like paper taking flight, like memories finding their way home. And every time I fold a new creation, I leave it outside my tent before sleeping. In the morning, they're always gone, disappeared like dawn mist, like grief transformed, like stories folded into shapes that can finally take wing and fly. The last time I visited, I found a single blank page by my tent. I spent the whole day writing on it, pouring out everything I'd learned about loss and memory and the strange magic of paper in the wilderness. That night, I left it outside my tent unfolded. In the morning, it was gone. In its place was a perfect origami heart, beating with all the words I'd never been able to say. GPS coordinates don't lie. That's what I kept telling myself as I checked the readings for the 4th time in an hour. But when every device shows your campsite slowly migrating toward a 200-foot ravine, while you're sitting perfectly still inside your tent, you start to question everything you thought you knew about fixed points in space. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for months, plotting my route through the Adirondacks with obsessive precision. As a geological surveyor, I'm used to relying on exact measurements and hard data. My girlfriend Emma jokes that I'm the only person she knows who creates spreadsheets for weekend camping trips. But after what happened out there, I'm not so sure about anything anymore, least of all the stability of the ground beneath our feet. The first discrepancy appeared on my second night out. I was updating my location log before turning in, standard procedure for solo backcountry camping, when I noticed the coordinates were off by about 3 feet from what I'd recorded at sunset. Not a huge difference, but enough to catch my attention. My first thought was simple GPS drift, the kind of minor variation you get from atmospheric interference or satellite positioning. But I had 3 separate devices: my primary GPS unit, my backup, and my phone, all showing the exact same shift. I rechecked my original reference points, the ones I'd marked when setting up camp. The physical landmarks hadn't changed. My tent was still the same distance from that distinctive lightning-scarred pine, still aligned with the large boulder I'd used as a windbreak. But according to every digital reading, my entire campsite had moved slightly northeast. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about tectonic plates, about the imperceptible movements happening beneath us all the time. But this was different. This was measurable movement happening in hours, not millennia. The morning brought another shift, 2 more feet toward the ravine. I spent an hour cross-referencing my paper maps with the digital readings, trying to find some explanation. The topographical lines on my map seemed wrong somehow, not dramatically, but subtly different from what I remembered when planning the route. I took photographs of the map spread out on my sleeping bag, carefully documenting the contour lines. Looking at those photos now, weeks later, I can see how the changes were already starting. The lines in the later photos are distinctly different from the earlier ones, as if the landscape itself was being slowly redrawn. By midday, my position had shifted another foot. I set up markers, sticks pushed into the ground at measured intervals, thinking I might be able to track any physical movement. But the stakes stayed exactly where I'd placed them, even as my GPS coordinates continued their slow migration northeast. That's when I noticed the compass. I keep an old-school magnetic compass as backup, a habit from my early surveying days. The needle was behaving strangely, swaying in small arcs before settling into a position that definitely wasn't north. When I checked against my other compasses, yes, I carry multiple professional habit. They all showed different directions, as if magnetic north was somehow fragmenting. I called Emma that evening, catching just enough signal to get through. I tried to explain what was happening without sounding crazy. The land is moving, I told her, but it's not moving. The maps are changing, but they're still the same. I know how this sounds, but Dash, pack up and come home. She said immediately, whatever's happening, it's not worth the risk. She was right, of course, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. As a scientist, I was witnessing something impossible, something that challenged everything I understood about geographic stability. I had to know more. That night, I dreamed of maps. In the dream, I was walking across a giant paper map, watching as the contour lines shifted beneath my feet like living things. The topographical features writhed and reformed, mountains flowing like water, valleys reaching up to become peaks. I woke in a cold sweat to find my tent 6 feet closer to the ravine. The physical world still looked unchanged. Same trees, same rocks, same sky. But according to every measurement, every device, every calculation, I was moving steadily toward that 200-foot drop. Or maybe the drop was moving toward me. At that point, I wasn't sure which was worse. I spent the morning taking readings and samples, testing soil composition, checking rock strata, anything that might explain what was happening. The geological data was inconsistent. Samples taken from the same spot showed different mineral compositions. Rock layers appeared to be rearranging themselves between observations. By afternoon, the ravine was visible through the trees, closer than it should have been, closer than was possible without massive geological upheaval. But there had been no earthquakes, no landslides, no physical signs of movement at all. Just a steady, inexorable shift of digital coordinates and changing maps. The compass readings were getting worse. Each one pointed in a completely different direction now, the needle spinning lazily as if drunk on possibilities. My paper maps had become almost unreadable, the contour lines blurring and shifting even as I watched. When I tried to photograph these changes, the images came out distorted, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on reality anymore. That's when the text from Emma came through. Check the historical surveys. Of course, the National Geological Survey database, which I downloaded to my tablet before the trip. I spent the next hour comparing historical data for this area, going back decades. What I found chilled me more than the autumn air. The ravine wasn't supposed to be here at all. According to surveys from the 1950s, this entire area was a gentle slope. The ravine appeared in the 1970s surveys, but half a mile east of my position. By the 1990s, it had moved to roughly its current location, but it was only 50 feet deep then. The most recent surveys showed its current depth of 200 feet. The land wasn't moving. It was rewriting itself. As the sun set, I made my final recordings. My campsite had shifted another 12 feet toward the ravine edge, though my physical markers hadn't moved an inch. The compass needles now spun in perfect circles, endless loops of searching for a north that no longer existed. My maps had become abstract art, contour lines flowing like river currents across the paper. I packed up in the dark. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to stick around to see the conclusion. As I hiked out by headlamp, I swear the terrain changed behind me, paths disappearing, new ones forming, the very shape of the mountain rearranging itself like a shuffle of geological cards. The coordinates I recorded during that retreat don't make sense. According to the GPS, I walked over 300 miles that night, though I only covered about 6 actual miles back to my car. The topographical maps I brought home show different features every time I look at them, like a slow-motion kaleidoscope of shifting Earth. Emma helped me compile all the data into a report, but we never submitted it. How do you explain to the scientific community that a piece of the Adirondacks has become unmoored from geographical reality? That true north has become a matter of opinion? That the very ground beneath our feet might be less stable than we thought? Not in the geological sense, but in a deeper, more fundamental way? I still check the coordinates sometimes, marking the continued migration of that patch of forest. According to the latest readings, my campsite would now be floating somewhere in the middle of that impossibly deep ravine. The historical surveys have become even stranger, showing features that appear and disappear across decades like geological ghosts. Maybe some places are meant to remain unmapped. Maybe the act of measuring, of fixing points in space, sometimes causes reality to rebel, to remind us that the world is stranger and more fluid than our instruments can capture. I haven't been camping since that trip, but sometimes late at night, I take out my compass and watch the needle spin, wondering if somewhere in those mountains, true north is still wandering, searching for its way home through a landscape that refuses to stay still. And I wonder what other fixed points in our world might not be so fixed after all.